paper that I so enjoyed reading, you say that there is no Sputnik moment, but we are definitely at a Nuremberg moment. And in acknowledging this moment, I want to begin the discussion by evoking Justice Jackson. Before the Nuremberg trials, he reminded the world that the wrongs we seek to condemn are so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. I wanted to acknowledge this moment in time. Professor Huq, as a human rights lawyer, I welcome the polemic of your argument. The shift from a human rights framework towards a democratic regulation of AI, or what you call a forward-looking policy considerations rather than a rights framework in regulating AI systems. You say policy rather than rights provide a more tractable and useful object of inquiry. Again, I wish to remind ourselves of this moment in time. Democratic arrangements themselves have flawed foundations, and we see democratic arrangements are not always led by civic-minded participants in democracy with the common ambition of the public good. Again, I quote you. Many of our nation states, Professor Huq, as well as communities, are led by populist and fundamentalist forces. As both a defender and a critique of human rights, I want to go back to the genesis of the founding Human Rights Covenant, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was a genesis full of tension and contestation, so much so that the Saudi delegate challenged the authors of the covenant for its Western slant or Western exceptionalism. In his words, they had, for the most part, taken into consideration only the standards recognized by the Western civilizations and had ignored more ancient civilizations which were past the experimental stage. However, a few women delegates brought clarity to the discourse. The Pakistani delegate, a woman, said that it was important that the world recognizes a common code of civilized behavior that would apply in both international and foreign policy. And the woman delegate from India, Hansa Mehta, is widely credited with making a significant change in the language of Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by replacing the phrase, all men are born free and equal, to all human beings are born free and equal. All of this is to say that unbridled by the checks and balances of human rights, policy regulations will lead to a certain exceptionalism and a fundamentalism, rather than a pluralism in ideas and experiences. It may mean the regulation by a few elected male hierarchies. The democratic project in all of our civilizations left women and minorities out. I worry that without human rights, democratic performance endogenous to the design and operation of AI will be deeply flawed. One example is the Aadhaar system, the biometric ID system in India, the brainchild of brilliant and visionary men, and incubated in one of the most hallowed halls and innovative spaces in the world, MIT. It was flawed in its application to women and persons with disabilities. It was the human rights challenge that provided the guardrails and the checks and balances to an ambitious and soaring vision for the global South. Professor Huq, you provide a powerful example of Michigan's Midas tool, which was challenged. Without the human rights framework, how can we challenge economic institutions? Even development banks like the Asian Development Bank and the African Development Bank that will not provide AI-driven credit to women in the global South because the AI systems do not recognize our patriarchal legal systems that do not acknowledge women as heads of households or their equal rights to inheritance. Professor Huq, as you rightly argue, context shapes organizations, institutions, and government design making. But without a human rights framework, it is difficult to engage in meaning making, in dealing with underrepresented groups such as indigenous populations and agricultural workers in the global South. Finally, you say Lon Fuller's vision of polycentric disputes call for foregrounding policy rather than rights. You argue that central to the public empowerment necessary to counteract both kinds of barriers is the possibility of a social movement capable of frontally challenging policies surreptitiously advanced by AI systems. You cite as examples several endogenous movements in the Western tech hub. I think for a truly democratizing vision of change, we need social movements akin to the Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement, led by survivors of discrimination, violence, and bias. Or better, even better, a movement led by those in the rural global South who are underrepresented in these new technologies. Their concerns fall squarely within Lon Fuller's claim of polycentric disputes. The issue is important to the underrepresented because the argument that polycentric issues are non-justiciable is more frequently raised in the context of resource allocation disputes. Such disputes frequently involve claims to health, education, social security, or housing resources. As such, Professor Huq, they often concern the human rights claims of the highest order. So once again, your paper was one that I thoroughly enjoyed. It was something that broadened the frontiers of my own intellectual horizons. But I would like to argue that the democratic project of taming AI systems demands both plural democratic frameworks and the human rights system. Professor Huq?
Thanks. I've turned off my mute. Am I loud enough? Am I good? Okay, great. Well, let me start out by saying thanks to Shashank for putting this event together. It's enormously kind to have done so, and it's always a delight when you know, I have the typical academic attitude where I'm mildly surprised that anyone ever reads anything that I write, and I'm actually positively shocked when somebody actually has a reaction to it. So I'm delighted to hear. Can I just say, Rangita?
Of course, absolutely.
All right. Delighted to hear the objections that she raises to the paper. Let me try and spend maybe 5 minutes. I probably will go over that, situating the paper, and then I do want to say a couple of things in response to her fascinating and provocative comments. So this is a paper that is in one of 2 lines of work that I have done on the adoption of AI, principally in the context of state action rather than private action. In one line of work, I've focused on the question of how new technologies require or force a rethinking of the conceptual substance of rights. What does equality, for example, or the norm of non-discrimination mean in a context in which decisions are predictions derived from large N bodies of data with more features than a human can account for, and a cost function that cannot even be verbalized or written down, right? What does equality or non-discrimination mean in that context? How do we think about due process with respect to machine decisions? That's another paper that I wrote. This paper, which was written at the request of an institute at Columbia called the Knight Institute, is part of a separate line of work with Tino Cuellar, who was a professor at Stanford, a justice on the California Supreme Court, and is now the president of the Carnegie Foundation for World Peace. Tino exists so that I can feel bad about my own professional accomplishments or lack thereof. But Tino and I have been working for a number of years in thinking through what does it entail for our democratic institutions that AI has emerged as a regulatory tool and as an object of regulation. And that, I think, is a question which is related to the question of rights, but I think is distinct. And we've pursued this question through a paper on the political economy of state adoptions of machine learning, and in a couple of papers, in a long book review of Shoshana Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, and then in this Knight Institute paper, and then a forthcoming article in Daedalus, where we try and what the aim of the paper is to think through the conceptual landscape that is necessary for the American regulatory state to grapple with the sharp moral and normative challenges presented by AI. So notice that there's a couple of divergences from the framework that Ranjita just laid out. Right? This is a paper that exists within a very American context. I don't want to apologize for that. It's a paper that's meant to speak primarily to American policymakers and primarily to think about the changes in the structure or the substance of American administrative law in particular that are warranted given the adoption of AI tools either by the state or by the entities such as social media platforms that the state might want to regulate. So it's working in a different intellectual space, I think. And the contribution that the paper aims to make in the space is very much conceptual, right? I think there are three moves in the paper, and I'll say them in one sentence each. The first is to reject what I think Bernard Harcourt does, which is to say that democratic regulation of AI is infeasible. The second move is to offer this concept of AI systems as embedded, as a heuristic for thinking about what is the object of regulation, or what is the unit of regulation that we need to pay attention to. And then third, to draw this a distinction between ontological and institutional barriers to effective regulation, where I think where the paper argues a lot of attention has gone to ontological barriers, especially in Zuboff's work, where the institutional questions, which are kind of boring, mundane questions of how agencies operate when they adopt tools, how they update their rules periodically. All of those questions, we think are much more important practically, but have not received as much attention. Okay, so I think that's just a very different intellectual universe from the framing that Ranjita put forward. That said, I want to resist a number of the conclusions, or I want to resist some of the conceptual taxonomy that Ranjita has offered, and push back on the idea that either a rights framing or a human rights framing in particular are necessary in terms of being logically or conceptually or analytically prior to effectual regulation of what I think she and I would agree are the serious questions of exploitation, marginalization, and in certain instances, domination of individuals through AI, whether it's AI in the hands of private corporations or whether it's AI in the hands of the state. Okay, let me try and say a couple of things on that score. So the first point to make is I think that there is no implication that should be drawn from the juxtaposition of rights against policy, that the pursuit of policy is free of normative objectives. To the contrary, policy is a way of framing the pursuit of exactly the same normative objectives that Ranjita has put on the table. So the juxtaposition is not meant to exclude any set of more or less progressive, what in the US would be called progressive policy goals from the agenda. To the contrary, I think that there are, at least, again, this may be making a point that resounds particularly in the US experience, good reasons for preferring the policy rather than the rights framing as an instrument for, or as a lens onto the set of moral and normative challenges that I think Rantito very effectively laid out. The first reason for disfavoring the rights lens is, in particular in the United States, rights have been understood as a binary. Rights have been understood as a relationship between A, who has a right, and B, who has a duty, right? Some of you who are law students may recognize that framing as being associated with the early 20th century legal realist Wesley Hofeld. And Hofeld insisted on this binary character of rights. And indeed, at least in the US tradition, the way that rights have been thought about is in this granular, atomic, quintessentially small L liberal form. And one of the claims in the piece is that granulated liberal conception of rights is utterly unfit for the complex context of in which and through which AI systems are implemented. In part because one reason for that is that the moral challenges presented by AI systems are often comparative in nature. It's often the fact that, let's say, a facial recognition system will have a higher error rate for, let's say, phenotypically dark faces, and in particular, phenotypically dark women's faces, as opposed to phenotypically lighter white faces. Right, it's not the distinctive error rate with respect to a particular person that's at stake. It's not the fact that the error rate doesn't fall below a certain threshold that constitutes the moral problem. It's a comparative quality of the way that the system ranks, organizes, distributes outcomes or outputs with respect to people, different figures with different subjects within the system, right? I think the same could be said for the problem of disinformation, where in a sense, the problem of disinformation and the effect of organized campaigns of disinformation upon the public sphere and upon the interests that people have, both in democratic rule and in the receipt of truthful information, it is a problem of excess matching. It's a problem of algorithms on social media platforms being too good at predicting whether someone is likely to click on news X rather than news item Y. And the tendency of the algorithm's interaction, the tendency of the algorithm in its matching capability to bring out a certain kind of pathology with respect to human tendencies toward information acquisition, right? I think it's really hard to think about that, the set of problems that arise in the fake news on social media platforms context in terms of individual rights. I think you have to think about the problem in terms of the broad distributive tendencies of the instrument in relation to not just one slice of the population, but the population as a whole. So I think that there's a set of reasons that are embedded in the particulars of the technology that make the rights framework less than optimal for grappling with the kind of problems that I think are really important, and I think I share, and I fully agree, warrant scrutiny. I guess I have a couple of more things to say, but I'll say one more thing and then invite others to speak. I don't want to speak too long. I think a further reason for skepticism of rights that's particularly forceful in the United States context is if one looks back at the effort to instantiate moral values, progressive values of inclusion, of respect, of dignity, things that are embodied in my colleague Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach in particular, through the instrument of rights, I think that the American record is really, really checkered. For example, I'm teaching at the moment our first year class on the Equal Protection Clause, and we are doing Brown v. Board of Education. And one of the takeaways from Brown is that schools today are as segregated as they were in 1954. Brown, which is probably the most important rights decision in the US constitutional canon, is by the most important and the most obvious metric available, which is the rate of school desegregation. Brown is a failure, right? I just wrote a book on why the panoply of rights that are associated with the criminal justice process in particular, and rights against state violence, why those have proved to be a failure, right? As the BLM movement accurately and properly reminded us, because of the court's ability to manipulate remedies. So I look at the history of rights, vindication and articulation through, or I look at the use of rights as the means of vindicating and articulating basic human interests in the United States for the last 70 odd years. And I see a record of failure and no reason at all to be optimistic about that framework, right? And I want to recognize that there's an argument that people like Sam Moyn have made, which has a little bit of resonance to mine with respect to the incapacity of international human rights to accommodate distributive concerns, right? I want to recognize that, but I have to say I don't know enough about international human rights law to know whether Sam is right on that score. So I want to recognize that there's kind of an adjacent argument, but it's not the one that I'm making now. So let me stop there, because I think I just spoke for a good long time, and I'm not quite sure how we'll move forward, but look forward to more conversation.
Aziz, this was so exciting and fascinating. I wanted to respond to both Steve and Geeta, and so that we can continue listening to you and sharing our ideas with you. I want to take 2 points that you made and ask both Steve and Geeta to respond to those 2 points. But I want to preface them by just underscoring the fact that I do understand that you're speaking of a very unique context, the United States, but regulating AI in the United States has global implications. And that is why my response was very much within that framework. So Steve, as Aziz mentioned so eloquently, rights demand or create this binary framing. And this kind of binary aspect of the rights discourse is something you, Steve, has really emphasized. You have, for a long period of time, as my male ally, helped me situate the AI and bias policy lab at Penn Law. And as the Deputy Global Counsel on Human Rights at Microsoft, you have taught me 2 important lessons. One is the power of stories to reimagine our world, and 2, the transformative power of language to redefine our world. And you speak to the ways in which you use rights language very carefully when you speak to different constituents. When you speak to certain constituents, you use the rights language, but you use a different vernacular when you speak to different constituents. You use maybe ESG or compassionate capitalism or the business purpose for the public good. So you change your vernacular depending on your constituents. So can you speak to Aziz's own shift towards a language of forward-looking policymaking and that transformative impact, especially because, as he echoed your own sentiments, rights as a binary framing can be difficult and complicated in the US context. Steve?
Thank you. And Aziz, thank you for that tee-up of paper. Let me start by saying I'm going to speak in my personal capacity. It's not a Microsoft statement, any of these, but it is deeply informed by my experience over now a couple of decades working at Microsoft on these issues for the last decade, really focused on human rights. And a couple of high-level kind of framing issues. I almost think of this kind of an analog of Maslow's hierarchy, of thinking about the things that you raise in your paper, Aziz, and that is, we have social goals, and those are one of the things that you really have emphasized in this systemic thinking of what do we ultimately as a society want to achieve. And then I think of it, if you flow down the chart, there are governments. You can have a democratic government, you can have another, but actually those are means of pursuing social goals, we hope. That's the notion of it. And under that, I'd say we actually end up with inputs and tools. And AI feels to me to be pretty far down that stack. And so when I think of regulating AI, I think less about how we use AI to change what the social goal is, or to focus primarily on the social goal, and actually understanding that context of the social goal and the way the government and our administrative state is going to work. What are the constraints and incentives we want to place on the development of AI? So when I think of my job, it's really, I have a son who's a lawyer, and I tell him, yes, I practice law, but it's not like his. He's a litigator and doing what I think of as real law. I provide legally informed counseling to engineers and business people on the concerns out there in the real world, especially concerns I hear from human rights groups, from stakeholders who are not the typical people who are engaging with engineers, and then courses of action. And as I think about that, there's a disconnect between the place where you focus, which I view as fairly high up on the hierarchy, and actually regulating AI, which was the name of the paper. When I think of regulating AI, I find the human rights framing very helpful. And I think the best way of kind of capturing why is, I don't think we think of our policies and social goals informing what are the human rights. I think it's the other way around. Human rights actually help us define and clarify the social goals we want to pursue. And I say that because, as Ranjita knows, when I speak of human rights, I view that as placing the individual human being, and especially the most vulnerable, the least powerful, in opposition to what will be most convenient for the group or the state. And I find that's really helpful, including in talking with engineers of what's this system going to do for the most vulnerable person. You mentioned, the challenge we've had with facial recognition, but across the board, you run into this thing of when you have massive data sets, you're optimizing for what the math tells you. And then you have to have this overlay of, but wait a minute, what's it doing to those most vulnerable? And I think that's the better lens for me of thinking how we get AI as a tool ultimately to help us pursue those social goals. But I view them as different parts of the stack almost. I'll stop there. I have lots of other things, including the work that is happening in the EU, with their guidance on AI, and there's a lot of work happening in the US. Here in Washington State, where Microsoft is, there's a law on the use of facial recognition by state authorities, which goes to these very issues. And that's where I view it as we're legislating how a system must work and the transparency that must be there in order to enhance the opportunity to achieve social goals. But I don't view them so much as in opposition or lacking one another. It's rather seeing how we engage at what level of that stack to be most effective. But I'll stop there. And that, of course, is a very American perspective, but I think it applies certainly to the European context as well. Maybe not so much as we get into India or other parts of the globe. But I'll stop there at this point and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Steve. So Geeta, you're joining us from India, and I wanted to respond to Aziz's comment that rights have a checkered history in the United States. And you and I wrote a very short post for the Kennedy School last year on the importance of AI's corrective function using a substantive equality theory framework as against a formal equality theory framework to address the history of both gender and racial discrimination. And we asked how AI could play a corrective role in addressing the historic legacy of discrimination against women and minorities through affirmative action plans or through a temporary special measures theory that is recognized by the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And this was a framing that I came up with, and you problematized it by sharing with me a story from India where manipulating AIs can have its own risks. And you shared the story of voting machines in elections in India. So I thought you could talk a little bit about that in terms of, the corrective function of AI can actually create a backlash and be even more problematic. Just a moment, Geeta. I also wanted to speak of the Aadhaar system. It has great democratizing promise, and it is driven by an egalitarian vision, but it does pose threats to the human rights of women, persons with disabilities, Adivasis, and untouchables. So I do want you to speak to both those issues in addressing what Assis said about human rights having a checkered history in the United States. Geeta?
Thank you, Rangita. So this is a fascinating discussion, and I actually will agree more with Steve on this matter. And I'm speaking, so I started life as a software programmer. I'm an algorithms person, right? And so, I can speak to what the potential of the tool is, what it actually does. But, at the end of the day, an algorithm is only as good as the human being who programs it and the data set that it learns from, right? And you have to keep that in mind. That is the issue here. It is not a sentient conscious being. The whole name AI is a little bit of a misnomer in how it's implemented. It's not really AI as such. It is a reflection of the programmer and the data set, right? In my more recent avatar, I write legislation. So I'm the chief legal advisor for the Office of Senator Hines, the Massachusetts Senate. And one of the things I've realized, both using from both those hats, is from a practicality perspective, you can't proactively regulate AI. And the reason you can't proactively regulate AI has to do with, one, the nature of software itself, and two, the nature of regulation itself. And I understand that the human rights framework is not perfect, but in my opinion, it's actually the best way to look at this problem. And as an example, one of the things, so let's speak to both those aspects, the nature of the software and the nature of legislation. When you look at software, and this is very different, if you're a civil engineer and you build a bridge and it collapses, you can get sued under a theory of negligence or tort. That's the whole tort theory. Software programmers don't get sued for broken software. And Steve can speak to that. It's amazing how buggy our software is. Nobody successfully sues a software programmer for negligence. So there is no tort theory. And actually, that's one of the things I disagreed in your paper, was that there is a cause of action on the tort. There isn't, not for software, right? So that's the first thing to keep in mind, is you don't have that. There is nothing of that sort. And from a legislative process, if you understand the practicality of how the legislative process itself works, we don't do things proactively. I'd wish we did, but we don't. We wait for something really horrible to happen, and then we do it in a reaction to something horrible happening. Now, when you understand these two extremes, you understand that the only way then to try and regulate AI and put checks and balances in place is actually in talking about what's that horrible thing that's happening, right? And the only way to have that conversation about what's that horrible thing that's happening is to actually talk about human rights. You can't talk about torts. The theory of torts does not apply, right? So that's the thing to keep in mind. You have to look at it from a practitioner's lens. And I completely agree with you that, yes, the history of human rights in the United States is checkered, but so is the history of democracy, right? I mean, democracy is the, worst system we have, but it's the best we have, right? So I think you've got to understand it when you look at it in the context of both the nature of software and the nature of legislation. Unfortunately, the best way to go forward is through the study of human rights.
So Aziz, back to you.
Yeah, so I thank you both, Geetanjali and Steve, for those really interesting perspectives. Let me try and respond in a way that will move the discussion on. Let me start by responding to Steve, but the way that I want to do so is to use Steve's comment to make a larger point, which runs the risk of sounding a kind of aggressive and kind of mean-spirited, but I don't want to come out and it runs the risk of sounding very Chicago-y for those of you who are
Yes.
familiar with my institution's reputation, right? Which I find the reputation is probably more accurate than I'd like it to be, but it's not something that I want to engage in. So let me try and say this in a way that's not Chicago-y. I am left unclear by the pairing of comments. I'm left unclear about what exactly is being connoted by the term human rights and how it's different from what I connoted by values or by normative or moral values. Let me use Steve's intervention to illustrate that. Steve said, look, when I'm talking to my programmers, when I'm talking to my colleagues, this is what I heard. I find it useful to give them a framing that sounds in terms of human rights in order to push them to think about what their system is going to do. But in describing that framing, Steve, you didn't actually appeal to what I recognize as the vocabulary of human rights, which is the terminology used in the ICCPR or the UDHR or the like. What you actually appealed to was John Rawls's difference principle. You actually appealed to a Kantian, a neo-Kantian ethical claim about the priority of the least advantaged, that maybe it bears a relationship to those human rights instruments, right? There's certainly consistencies between Rawlsian ethics and human rights, but it's absolutely not the same thing, right? Notice that I appealed in my comments to another Rawlsian framework, which is my colleague Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach. But Martha doesn't think, and I'm pretty sure nobody else who reads her work thinks, that what she's describing is human rights. Okay, so notice that there's a move to say human rights is necessary, but then in actually describing it, what's being appealed to is not human rights. And I think that the same thing, or the same worry, I think, occurs to me with respect to what Geetanjali said, which is, so I think that there's a couple of issues in what you said, and which was really interesting. Let me pull out one that's related to this last point, and then let me turn to the other one. So the one that I think is related is this, that the claim is, look, you can't get regulation until something terrible happens, and then regulation is going to be responsive, right? Now that I think has a good deal of truth to it. Although, asterisk it with the caveat that, at least in the United States, a lot of legislation, particularly in the criminal domain, does not respond to actually bad things happening. It responds to moral panics about imagined bad things happening. Right, so think about the crack cocaine disparity in criminal sentencing statutes at the federal level. Think about the rise of youth criminalization in the wake of a super predators moral panic in the 1990s. So absolutely, you're right that regulation occurs, or legislation occurs, in the wake of a perceived crisis. And you say, look, in order to have legislation occur, you need to appeal to human rights to make apparent the stakes of that crisis. I think I accept the first part with respect to legislation. I think that what you're describing is an accurate feature of most the political economy of most legislative bodies.
Yeah, no, it's a practicality of politics.
But
This
wait,
has
wait,
nothing
but
to do
hold
with.
on.
Wait, yeah.
But my
Let's-
point, here's my point. It does not follow from that what you call the practicality of politics, that one needs a vocabulary of human rights to crystallize the interests that might motivate political action. There are many, many ways of framing those interests. Human rights provides one way it provides one set of one kind of normative vocabulary, but it's not the only one. I can make the same kinds of arguments in Nussbaumian capability terms, which I happen to find conducive, right? Steve just made them in Rawlsian terms, which clearly he finds conducive, right? Maybe you can make them in human rights terms, that's fine.
Yeah.
But there is nothing distinctive. There's nothing distinctive about human rights as a terminology, right? Maybe outside the United States, there are places where human rights has a greater resonance. I don't
May
think
I?
that-
Yeah.
I fundamentally disagree with that.
Steve,
Oh, good,
I'm going
good.
to have both of you respond to Aziz. This is becoming the kind of the debate that we want to have in academic circles.
Aziz, in first place, Aziz, don't try to qualify anything. I am a lawyer still, so I've got the alligator skin, you know, that I'm happy to take however you want to phrase it. And I love the conversation. Let me explain why I prefer human rights, and I don't think of myself as a Rawlsian. I don't object to it, but I think of myself as a human rights.
Steve, to the point of Rawls, I do want to problematize what you said about the Rawlsian theory of justice. My own understanding of Rawls is that he was a critique of majoritarian democracy. And that majoritarian rule was something that he not only critiqued, but he called for safety nets for the most underrepresented.
Yeah.
So the idea of using
I have no conflict with it. I just don't ground myself in the Rawlsian. Much as I, you know, love the book and I love the work that's flown from it. Let me start with this. I think our main disagreement, I would propose, Aziz, is you're speaking from the academy and I'm speaking from the factory in 19th century terms. On the ground, and especially this now applies to the largest digital companies on the planet who typically are American. There is a difference between saying, here is my personal philosophy, whether it's a philosopher like Rawls or it's our belief as Microsoft, here's what we think are the values, and we're going to use those to determine what we do, versus saying there are internationally recognized instruments where the globe has agreed, and if you join the United Nations, you've signed up at least to the Universal Declaration. And Article 1 of the Universal Declaration says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And you don't have to go to in the real world, people don't think in the whole-field terms of, hey, if there's this, then it must have this logical consequence. The reality is all human rights are interrelated, interdependent. They're all compromised in all sorts of ways, but you can frame it in a way that says this is a broad global perspective that we can adopt. And it's not based on either universal on American exceptionalism or even worse, the non-democratic thing of individual companies deciding. So we ground it there, not as a philosophical thing, but as a practical way of making sure we're looking at these things that I suspect you and I agree at the social goal, we like where it leads. But that was be my first. And the other is to Gitanjali's comment, I do believe that most regulation comes out of response to bad things that have happened in most laws. In fact, the 3 cases you use in your paper were, it was social media, it was the Michigan, trying to cut off funding of it, and then it was the bail decisions. Those were horrors that actually led to us talking about regulation. What we don't have is a lot of regulation discussion of if you're going to do things on improving the efficiency of energy delivery systems. So if you pick the non-harmful ones, it's much harder to get meaningful regulation. But I do think there's a lot of work happening very productively on the human-centered, the right-centered, not in the pure academic sense of it, but having that as a way of getting people to appreciate what we're trying to achieve. But I'll leave it there because I think you and I probably agree on a lot more than we.
Yeah, can I just, I don't mean to cut off.
Human rights for practical reasons.
I don't mean to cut off Gitanjali. I know you can see the hand, but can I respond?
Yeah.
Yes, of course, Aziz.
So I just posted a little bit ago a draft paper that's part of a symposium at the Chicago Journal of International Law into the Post, which actually picks up this point and addresses it, and it does it in the particular context of whether human rights norms ought to be a touch point for content moderation on social media platforms. And there's an argument that's been made by David Kaye, who is the special rapporteur on free expression, to that effect. And the Kaye makes the argument precisely, Steve, as you made it, right? It's the universalization, the non-parochialness of human rights that has an advantage. And I think that the argument is strongest at that point. Here's the problem with that argument, that it assumes that human rights norms are uniformly normatively desirable, and it assumes that human rights norms are not subject to the kinds of capture and distortion that we see, and that Ranjita, I think, accurately diagnosed at the level of municipal law in an age of populism and authoritarianism. Populists and authoritarians are perfectly capable of capturing and changing international human rights law to their ends, and we already see this in the changing terms of defamation or the debate about the defamation of religion, right? And I think that we should expect to see more of those changes in the content of those international human rights norms in the future, as the post, kind of call it the post-Fukuyamian end of history, bienfaisant consensus over democracy and a certain version of liberalism collapses, right? We're back to Ranjita's point about the moment that we're in globally. And the moral content of international human rights law starts to look, I think, quite different from the one that you and I suggest, or one that you and I would be simpatico with. So I guess the way of summarizing that is I think that the claim that you've just made is contingent upon the assumption that the political economy of the substance of human rights is static. And I don't think it is, it's dynamic.
And I know Gitanjali needs to speak, but very quickly in response to that, I would say it is a vocabulary that is shared, and it is an aspiration, and we're dealing with human beings who are imperfect, and it was a treaty. So this was a heavily negotiated diplomatic instrument. And of course, the rights conflict with one another. They're drafted in a way that you can drive a Mack truck through the ambiguities of them. The United States itself and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights took a reservation saying, we're not going to deal with what you said are the global norms on freedom of expression. We have the First Amendment. And so we have all of those problems. I still say it's better than the idiosyncratic, or I like this philosopher, you like that philosopher.
So Steve, to Aziz's point, we have only ratified in the United States 2 of the 10 core human rights treaties. We have not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child or the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which are the 2 most universally ratified treaties. So we are, in the words of one of your teachers at Columbia, we are a flying buttress rather than a pillar in the cathedral of human rights, Louis Henkin.
Yeah, well, we don't even like the economic, social, cultural rights.
He's the mantle of being a human rights leader.
But the ICCPR, I think, does go to these core concerns that are in your paper.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
But it doesn't capture the economic.
I'd like to make this point, and I want to.
Needs to speak.
I want to make this with an example, and I'm not disagreeing that that there are flaws, and in even the human rights framework is not perfect. But I want to be careful about virtue signaling, because I think in itself, that creates more problems. And let me just, it's true it's not perfect, but really the purpose from a legislative perspective is to advance the frontier just as much as you can get away with. So let me give you an example with a very tangible piece of legislation, which a group of us have been fighting to try and get through. It turns out in the United States today, the business of a private investment, in particular equity investment, is not subject to the sexual harassment and discrimination protections that employees are subject to. So it's perfectly legal for a venture capitalist to either harass a women entrepreneur or to discriminate in the provision of capital. This is really it has huge economic implications. Now, to me, it looks horrific. As a women technologist, I now understand, of course, why women start 50% of the business in the United States and only get 2.5% of venture capital, right? It is a market failure, in my opinion. But the interesting thing is, when we crafted legislation in the state of Massachusetts to push it through, and bring this change about under the leadership of the amazing senator by the name of Cindy Friedman, who is chair of the Ways and Means Committee, we found that the horrific visceral reaction to #MeToo allowed us to get the senators in the legislature to the point where they were willing to pass sexual harassment. But in the absence of having something visceral that they could respond to, they don't pass through discrimination, which seems wrong, right? When you look at it in the context of, it's wrong. But at least having that framework of understanding, well, if I had a perfect universe, I'd push through both sexual harassment and discrimination, but the social norm today only allows me to push through harassment. That's fine. I know what's better, and I push this as far as I can do it. And that's the practicality of getting legislation through. I don't like it, right?
Geeta,
Trust me, I would love to do what you do.
I'm now going to engage the students with Aziz. Shashank, do you have the questions from students?
Yes, we have a few questions here. Nikki had a question that she also wanted to ask. Nikki, if you could just jump in, if that's okay.
Hi, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My question sort of has been discussed as we've continued to speak, but it gets at the idea that I guess there's two parts. One is that human rights as a framework in the United States, I guess, so if rights haven't been protected in the way that we might hope they would, as Professor Huq had noted at the start, and the United States as a country hasn't embraced human rights frameworks like other countries in the world, might that suggest that maybe if we do want better outcomes, at least that human rights wouldn't necessarily be, doesn't it suggest that it would be doing something maybe different than we have in the past, hooking regulation to a human rights framework, and at a certain extent, isn't there only up from here? So yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Nikki. I'm going to take more questions so that we could respond in a more holistic manner. Shashank, can we take 2 more questions?
Sure, I have a question here as well from a student, but this is kind of going back to the discussion that was taking place a little earlier, sort of about the definitional grounds here. So I'll just sort of reframe this question in that regard. But there's this question about in the paper about what is an AI system. Professor Huq, you mentioned that early on, and in many respects, this can be construed as a technical question, but or it could be construed as a computational learning tool, as you described, sort of a la Fry. So the question is, I think a lot of times we are wrapped up in this sort of definitional construct discussion, and how we define things does matter, right? As this conversation has showed. So do you find that the method in which the technical elements of artificial intelligence technologies this speaks to your paper, but those definitions oftentimes can be colloquial or an engineering perspective, as Steve mentioned earlier. That distinction oftentimes comes down to an educational element where just folks don't have the ability to understand deeply these technologies. And, so how do you sort of redeem or how do policymakers address this issue from a educational standpoint? And is that something that should take place within the context of law schools, public policy schools, and just sort of general thoughts there in that regard? How do we approach these issues from sort of a more technical understanding in the future?
So Shashank, I'm going to take those two questions and ask each of us to respond to that. So Aziz, first you.
So thanks to both Nikki and to the person who asked the question. My view about the United States' history is that both efforts to introduce international human rights as a rhetorical framework, it's not just that efforts to introduce international human rights as a rhetorical framework have founded on the shoals of American intellectual nativism. It's that our own parochial framework of constitutional rights has largely failed to deliver, primarily because of weaknesses in the structure of our independent judiciary. And that, I'll appeal to the fact that I just wrote a book about that. And my own view is that it's not that we need to change the rhetoric that we use. It's that we need to fundamentally rethink the ways in which power is exercised through various institutional filaments in ways that shape outcomes. And I think that that's a very big project that doesn't have a particular focus here. But I don't think it turns upon the choice between international human rights versus constitutional rights versus some other rhetoric. I just don't think that that's that important. On the second question, I think that I do think that there is now an effort to instill some of that technical expertise in government, and that comes out of conversations with Tina Cuellar, who was part of a team that wrote a really fantastic report for the Administrative Conference of the United States on how federal administrative agencies are adopting AI. And so I do think it's possible to install expertise at the level of the of agencies. I do think it's possible to broaden law students' understandings, and so programs like this, classes like the one that Ranjita teaches, I think are extremely important. I'm skeptical for the reasons that Gitanjali identified, that we should place too much stock on legislators having much capacity to do so. And I just flag the importance of private companies like Microsoft. So I'm writing a little piece with a lawyer called Glenn Gerstle, who was the chief lawyer for the director of national intelligence for many, many years. And one of the points that Glenn made in conversation that really has stuck with me is I was talking to him as if there was this sort of sharp divide between the state and private companies. And at some point he was just like, no, you just don't understand how the world works. And at least in the national security domain, the private companies are there's so much dependency on private companies. I assume Microsoft is one of them, and so much sort of codependency with respect to both technical competencies and understanding of where the national security vulnerabilities are. That this notion that there's a distinction between what the company is doing and what the state's doing is fantastical. And so I think that places, I take Glenn at his word, and I think that places a great weight on people like Steve and the office, the compliance and the legal and the norms generating offices in this small cluster of tech firms. And much as there's been activity under the antitrust umbrella in respect to tech, I don't see that concentration of effectual quasi-political power is changing anytime soon. So I would almost reverse the question, therefore, and say, look, the question is, how do you infuse institutions that are very, very good on the tech side with the moral values?
Geeta?
Yeah, no, so actually, you were mentioning this dinner we had just a few days ago, just before I left for India. And Phumzile, who's an amazing woman, raised this point that whenever there is a, you have independence, and you form, there are all these great leaders that come in. And then over time, when you go to the second generation and the third generation, that same sense of commitment and purpose disappears and you don't have it. So how do you stop systems from going to seed, right? Because we're always we're hoping the legislator will fix it. We're hoping the tech company will fix it. But I think the crux of it comes down to actually having those discussions, the education. The problems of the US don't have to do with the constitutional framework or whether or not they're adopting the human rights framework. They have to do with a process whereby we've ceased to have dialogue. I may disagree with you completely. I've still got to be, for a democracy to function, I still have to be willing to have the dialogue with you. And there's a lovely book on this called The Big Sort that was written about a decade ago that talks about the fact that people have essentially self-selected away and formed communities, and they're not having the debate and the discussion. So it's really much more about people in changing the way people are interacting than trying to say, well, there's something wrong with the constitutional framework or there's something wrong with the human rights framework. So I genuinely think it's about educating people, and the best place to start educating people, and yes, education's a continuous process. You've got to be doing it in the corporations, you've got to be doing it in the legislature, you've got to be doing it, but you start with the schools. And it's about having a cadre of students that are willing to have an open discussion with people they disagree with, to understand each other's point of view and come together with the best consensus. And that's what we should be doing.
So Geeta, I'm going to go next because I want Steve to close us out. To your point, Aziz, about the tech side needing to come together to marry the moral values, to marry the ways in which, and I know at heart you are a human rights advocate, Aziz, because your whole Nussbaum's theory and the Rawlsian theory of justice, they are situated and anchored in the human rights framework. It's a different vocabulary. So I do salute you for your arguments, but I do want to suggest that when you use the term moving away from human rights, it's an invitation for human rights advocates to engage with you. So, you are the first to use that term, human rights, in an AI scholarship. So it is important that we as human rights scholars and activists and corporate lawyers engage with you on the role that human rights can play. And to your point about engaging on the moral values with the technologies, my class incubates those ideas, brings together conversations across the disciplinary divides with poets, with philosophers, with writers, with artists, designers, technologists, CEOs, founders, venture capitalists, lawyers, for that very same connection that you're talking about. The only thing that I would steer clear from in this discussion is creating a clash of civilizations. And that is why I do not like the idea that somehow human rights are truncated, us against them, that human rights are something out there in the global village and are not part of the human rights discourse here in the United States, or that there is a divide between the global South and the global North. So, and that is why the effort at the lab is to bring the voices from the global South together with the voices in the global North. And that is why every discussion, every discourse that I engage in has that juxtaposition. So this has been enormously dynamic, a debate that needs to take place regularly. And I thank you, Aziz, for provoking that. This was, as I started by saying, a set of polemics that we needed to engage with. And we celebrate and honor your scholarship and for providing us with this kind of delicious engagement with Nussbaum and Rawls from the perspective of AI. So with that, Steve, I'm going to ask you to make the concluding remarks to send us off
I mean,
with greater
I
hope.
don't know whether you can read this, but it's the European document on the EU guidelines on ethics in artificial intelligence. And so Professor Hoek, I'd say Ranjita mentioned this. I don't care what language we use. It can be ethics, it can be whatever you like, it can be human rights. I actually prefer, as a practical matter, human rights. If I can bring people there, it's a global conversation. You don't, and by the way, the people who are my strongest allies on ethical or rights respecting or human-centered AI are the human rights advocates. Those are the groups. We don't have big analogs in the ethical community of the ethics, community who have all of the funding and the advocacy. So my view is we probably agree on overlappingly, if it's a Venn diagram, we're probably 90% there. I just find that it's worthwhile noting that the US is under 5% of the globe's population. My experience dealing with academicians, I know David Kaye very well, we work together. Everybody in law school loves the First Amendment, but it's really worthwhile realizing that it's under 5% of the globe who actually is there. And we actually, as a company, and I think the way the industry is working, there are the ESG things, which are undefined, but there's also this notion of ethical, responsible behavior that people are going to be able to support and want the companies to be engaged in this work. So we have a need to have people actually trust us. And I just find some vocabulary is more helpful than others. But if I'm in a discussion with people who are professional ethicists, I'm quite happy talking about all this stuff in the ethics vocabulary and framing. But I will say, when I'm dealing around the world on these issues, appealing to the UN and the Universal Declaration saves us from being the ugly American saying this is how we believe and we're going to export this, like it or not. That's kind of where I think we are. But I congratulate you on the paper and really appreciated reading it. Thanks for participating.
Thank you. Thank you, Aziz, for provoking this discussion. As you can see, this is an impassioned discussion on your paper. And I do hope that we can take this paper and this discussion to different forums, not just in the United States, but around the world, so that we can really create a, you call it an epistemological community that is involved in this issue. I want to thank Shashank for envisioning this program. Shashank, this was your idea to have Professor Aziz with us. And I'm thrilled that we were able to be joined by voices from Microsoft. Microsoft is probably, the most important voice in this area. And Geeta, who in more ways than I have revealed to you, is connected to these issues. Aziz, this is a very personal vignette, spoke of Nussbaum's capabilities theory, which she was a co-architect of that with Amartya Sen. And Geeta's father and Amartya Sen were the first South Asian students to graduate from Harvard Law School with a PhD in economics. So in so many ways, there is this kind of connective tissue that bonds all of us together on this common challenge of a more ethical, more fairer, more equitable world that is being unleashed by artificial intelligence. So thank you very much, and good luck to my students. Thank you for joining. Thank you, Shashank.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you so much, everybody. Hope you have a lovely weekend ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.